They were called lacrimatories, delicate glass vials no larger than a thumb, sealed tight with wax and filled with the tears of the grieving. In Victorian England, mourning wasn't simply endured. It was measured, ritualized, counted, down to the very last drop. These tear-catchers didn't just collect sorrow, they preserved it like relics of emotional truth. And when the tears inside finally evaporated, it was said the soul had wept enough and mourning could finally end. But behind the ornate lace veils and black crepe armbands, a darker truth festered. Death was more than an end. It was a performance, a theater of grief, where every sigh, every sob, every silent room was part of a carefully orchestrated rite. In these shadowed homes, death wasn't tucked away in sanitized hospital wards. It sat openly in the parlor, under the watchful eye of the living. Because once someone died, they were never left alone, not for a moment. The vigil began immediately. A body would lie in state in the very room where tea had once been served. Music played, and polite laughter danced off the wallpaper. Now that space was dim, silent, suffocating. Black ribbons tied around door handles. Clocks stopped at the moment of death. Even the family dog, if it howled, was feared to be foretelling another imminent passing. And always, someone sat beside the corpse, watching, whispering prayers, eyes red but wide open. Why? Some believed this kept the soul from wandering too far too fast, offering comfort during the transition. Others muttered of more practical fears. What if the person wasn't truly dead? What if their breath, faint as it was, had simply slipped beneath notice? And then there were rats. Yes, even the wealthiest households had them. And rats, drawn by the scent of stillness, were known to chew, so someone watched. Not just for comfort, but for confirmation, for defense, for dignity. But the fear didn't stop with breathless bodies or gnawing rodents. There was something deeper, something unseen. That's why every mirror in the house was draped in thick black cloth, not for aesthetic reasons, not for respect, but because of a Victorian terror few today remember. Mirror. Entrapment. They believed that reflective surfaces were dangerous during mourning, capable of trapping a soul mid-departure. Worse, some whispered that the dead could reach through the glass and pull someone in. So every mirror, every portrait with painted eyes, was hidden, covered, bound. The line between the living and the dead had grown too thin, and the glass might forget which side was which. These weren't primitive fears. They were sophisticated, civilized, codified in books and etiquette manuals. Queen Victoria herself, draped in eternal black for 4 decades after Albert's death, made sure of it. She turned mourning into a national identity, a culture of grief so strict it dictated the very fabric you could wear. Silk was too cheerful, jet black crepe was acceptable, even your jewelry, tiny brooches woven from the hair of the deceased, had to align with proper mourning etiquette. Hair, after all, never decomposes. It lasts, like memory, like guilt. And wearing it close to your heart was seen as a tribute, a sacred tether to someone no longer breathing. His nose starts once more, in celesophagia. Yet beneath all this solemn ritual, something more primal stirred. The Victorians, for all their obsession with science, industry, and progress, feared death with a medieval intensity. That fear gave rise to inventions so bizarre they border on the grotesque. Coffins with built-in bells, yes, real bells, attached to strings that led inside the casket, tied around the wrist or finger of the buried. The purpose? If the dead weren't dead, they could ring for help. It happened more than we like to admit. Illnesses that mimicked death, states of catatonia, even premature burial by mistake or on purpose. So people were buried with hope, a rope, a bell, a final desperate lifeline clawing back toward the world of the breathing. And while they waited, some decayed in the parlor for days. not always embalmed, not always fresh. In summer, you can imagine the scent. They called them death watches, but they were more than that. They were performances of control over what could not be controlled. We watched the dead, perhaps because deep down, we feared they were watching us. Photographs were taken too, but not in life. In death, post-mortem photography became an art. Children posed with their dead siblings, husbands seated beside wives, their skin already graying, the deceased propped up by iron braces, their eyes painted open on the daguerreotype plate. These photos weren't macabre, they were memorials. Sometimes they were the only photo a family ever had, but look close and you'll see the difference. The unnatural stillness of a corpse among the living. The way the light bends around the eyes of someone no longer there. Doctors made money selling miasma masks, perfumed beaks worn to block the supposed stench of death's poisonous air. Undertakers hired professional mourners, strangers who would cry convincingly enough at funerals to show that the deceased had lived a life worthy of sorrow. Mourning became not just a rite, but an industry. A machine of grief where every tear had a price. Every black veil a timeline, every silence a code. Yet maybe the most haunting truth is this. The Victorians didn't surround death with ritual to embrace it, but to hold it off, to contain the chaos it threatened to unleash. By giving death its own language, its own furniture, its own etiquette, they domesticated it, caged the beast behind lace curtains and silver urns. But sometimes the beast found a way out. In the flicker of a gas lamp, in the silent mirror, in the photograph where no one remembered who was living and who had already gone. And so these traditions lingered, slowly decaying like the corpses they once surrounded. The modern world moved death out of the home, into hospitals, funeral parlors, crematoriums, sanitized, separated, forgotten. But the old ways whisper still, in family legends, in dusty attics filled with forgotten black dresses, in tear-shaped vials that no one dares open, and in mirrors that even now some people cover without quite remembering why. But what if the rituals weren't only for the dead? What if, behind the velvet curtains and tear-soaked linens, the pageantry of Victorian mourning hid something even more unsettling? A fear, not of dying, but of returning. Because death for the Victorians was never final. It was a door, and some believed it could swing both ways. That's why they didn't just bury their loved ones. They sealed them, locked them in lead-lined coffins, built mausoleums with trapdoors, cemented crypts beneath churches. Some families even placed cages, iron bars, over graves. These weren't to keep grave robbers out. They were to keep the dead in. And this wasn't just superstition, it was obsession, rooted in something ancient and unspoken, the dread of revenants, the belief that the dead, wronged or restless, could claw their way back. Some called them ghosts, others vampires. The words changed across countries, but the fear remained that death might not be the end of suffering, but its beginning. In 19th century New England, entire families were exhumed when tuberculosis spread. The disease killed slowly, wasting the body into a pale, breathless shell, a living corpse. Locals, terrified by the contagion, turned to old-world remedies. They believed a dead relative, now undead, was feeding on the living, so they dug up the bodies, and when they found one not as decayed as it should be, heart still red, blood still pooled, they burned the heart on a pyre, made surviving family members drink the ashes mixed with water. They called it a cure. History calls it horror. But the fear went deeper still, into the body itself, into how it could betray you. The Victorian era gave rise to medical science, but it was still a time of shadowed ignorance. Autopsies were rare. Mistakes were common. The line between life and death blurred by disease, opium, laudanum. There are records, many, of people buried alive, not legends, not rumors. Documents, Reports of scratch marks inside coffin lids, torn fingernails, mouths open mid-scream, entire graves exhumed because of muffled cries heard beneath the earth. And so, they invented the safety coffin. An absurdly real invention. It came with a pipe for breathing, a flag or bell above ground, and sometimes even food and a lamp. Just in case. Just in case. In case death changed its mind. But even with these precautions, some preferred never to be buried at all. Some demanded cremation. Others willed their bodies to be sealed in alcohol or kept above ground, visible, eternal, anything to avoid the horror of waking up underground, with no light, no air, no voice that could reach the living. You see, death was terrifying, but so was being forgotten inside it. The mourning rituals, those elaborate dances of grief, were also ways of keeping memory alive. But memory is fragile, and grief can warp. That's why so many Victorian mourners turned to the occult, seances, table-turning, spirit photography, mediums claiming to channel the voices of the dead in hushed drawing rooms lit only by flickering candlelight. Even the most respected minds, scientists, politicians, scholars, were drawn to the possibility that death wasn't a wall but a veil. Thin, permeable. Arthur Conan Doyle, Sir William Crookes. Even Queen Victoria herself, desperate to hear Albert's voice again, consulted mediums in secret. They wanted proof, or maybe they wanted forgiveness, closure, or one final chance to say the words they never dared in life. And then came the photographs. Spirit photos, blurry faces hovering over mourning families, translucent hands resting on shoulders. Were they double exposures, tricks of the light, or something else? Whatever the explanation, people believed, because belief was comfort, and comfort was scarce in a world where children died in their cribs, wives during childbirth, husbands in factories, and no one knew why. Disease had no mercy, grief had no medicine. So the people invented meaning. They built myths around the silence. Even architecture bore the marks of mourning. Cemeteries designed like cities for the dead, iron gates shaped like weeping willows, mausoleums that looked like miniature cathedrals. Death was no longer just an event, it was a place, a neighborhood, a landscape of grief where the wealthy bought status in stone, and the poor were buried in mass graves with numbers, not names. And for those who could afford it, epitaphs were carefully chosen to tell stories in 10 words or less. Gone too soon, sleep beloved, not lost but gone before. But walk through those cemeteries now and you'll feel it, the weight of forgotten sorrow pressing through the moss-covered stones. And what of those who died violently, unbaptized, unmourned? They weren't buried in cemeteries, they were cast into unmarked plots, suicide victims, executed criminals, the mentally ill, considered cursed, beyond redemption. In some towns, people planted thorn bushes over their graves to keep them trapped. In others, they drove stakes through the bodies. These weren't ancient pagan rituals. They happened in the heart of the so-called modern world. They were attempts to control fear by ritual violence, acts of desperation masked as protection. But not all horrors were born of fear. Some were manufactured. There were charlatans, of course, fake mediums exploiting grief, selling false hope in the form of whispered names and cold drafts. But there were also doctors, real doctors, experimenting on the dead, dissecting bodies stolen from graves, bodies that had not consented. In Edinburgh, the Burke and Hare murders, killers who delivered fresh corpses to anatomy schools. They didn't wait for death, they created it, because fresh cadavers paid better, and death, in the end, was a business. Even mourning fashion had its economics. Black dye was expensive. The mourning industry sold everything from black umbrellas to stationery edged in soot-colored ink. There were even mourning dolls, small porcelain figures dressed in black, placed on children's graves. If a child died young, and so many did, families could order a doll in their image, to dress, to hold, to weep over. It sounds monstrous, but in a world with no therapy, no time to grieve, no words for trauma, people did what they could to make sense of the senseless. And maybe that's the thread tying all of it together. The tears in the glass vial, the bells in the coffin, the veiled mirrors, the spirit photos. It was all about making meaning out of death's chaos, about finding structure in what cannot be structured, a desperate attempt to look at the abyss and not look away, because to the Victorians death was not the enemy, forgetting was. Losing someone completely, not just from the world, but from the memory of the world, that was the real horror. Today, we hide death behind closed doors. We bleach it, burn it, erase it from our photos, our timelines, our stories. But the Victorians looked it in the eye, sat beside it, named it, photographed it, feared it, yes, but faced it. And in their rituals we can still hear echoes of something ancient, something sacred, something human. A need to be remembered. A cry, not from the grave, but from the living, reaching backward, hoping someone somewhere is still listening.